know that was a lot, and try to distill it down. What Lewis presents in that interaction is the way that modernity creates conditions for the dark enchantment to work. So modernity is a dark enchantment which makes atheism and unbelief feel plausible. How does it do it? Well, there's an argument. There's a projection reduction argument that spiritual things are just projection of earthly things based on the similarity between them. That's one. Then there's a rhetorical tone of mocking dismissal that makes you feel insecure in your belief because you don't want to be thought of as a child. Then there's a myth, what he calls a myth. And a myth here doesn't mean it's a false story. It means a story that lands first on the imagination before it ever lands on your reason. Okay? That's the idea. So a myth is just, it's an appeal to your imagination, and that the myth of universal evolutionism, which for Lewis even, he was distinguishing that from like actual belief in evolution as a scientific fact. He's like, he just deferred to biologists on that, and himself probably had some sort of notion, yeah, that's probably the way it works. I do my thing, they do their thing. But he recognized that when they moved from science to this other thing, that he was like, oh no, that's my world. Like I live with myths, and I can recognize a myth when I see it. And so this is about imagination. And he says, and at some number of places he says the myth came first, the science followed after. All of it was the myth that came and sort of captured the imaginations, and then the science was fit into it. So that myth of universal evolution is the deepest habit of the modern mind. Little things turn into big things, simple things get more complex. And that had been sort of reinforced to us by our experience, either in biological stuff, acorns to oaks, or in our technological progress. And that's when I jumped, and this was the fast part, so just to get that. The idea is that the modern world is always trying to make things controllable, sort of assert dominance over reality. And in doing so, catechizes us, trains us to think of things that are real or things that are controllable. And it makes it easy to believe that there are no other agencies in reality which we have to respect. Because it's just a matter of finding the right hack to figure out how to then make it toolified, make it instrumentalized for human consumption and human good, or human wills. So that's the basic idea. And that because we've been so successful, that's the background noise, that's the incense in the air, that's what we're breathing in all the time that makes it hard to think, so that when that argument comes, your belief in God is just projection of your own father issues into the sky. That we go, that kind of makes sense. And we feel it kind of like we have to fight it. Okay? That's where we took. So then where do we go from there? I'm going to finish reading the story, the section of the story, and then we'll talk about Puddleglum's defiance, Puddleglum's faith. So remember they had, to sleep without foolish dreams. Here we go. The prince and the two children were standing with their heads hung down, their cheeks flushed, their eyes half closed, the strength all gone from them, the enchantment almost complete. But Puddleglum, desperately gathering all his strength, walked over to the fire, and then he did a very brave thing. He knew it wouldn't hurt him quite as much as it would hurt a human, for his feet, which were bare, were webbed and hard and cold like a duck's. But he knew it would hurt him badly enough, and so it did. With his bare foot, he stamped on the fire, grinding a large part of it into ashes on the flat hearth. And three things happened at once. First, the sweet, heavy smell grew very much less. For though the whole fire had not been put out, a good bit of it had, and what remained smelled very largely of burnt marshwiggle, which is not at all an enchanting smell. This instantly made everyone's brain far clearer. The prince and the children held up their heads again and opened their eyes. Secondly, the witch, in a loud, terrible voice, utterly different from all the sweet tones she had been using up till now, called out, "What are you doing? Dare to touch my fire again, mud filth, and I'll turn the blood to fire inside your veins." Thirdly, the pain itself made Puddleglum's head for a moment perfectly clear, and he knew exactly what he really thought. There's nothing like a good shock of pain for dissolving certain kinds of magic. "One word, ma'am," he said, coming back from the fire, limping because of the pain. "One word. All you've been saying is quite right, shouldn't wonder. I'm a chap who always likes to know the worst and then put the best face I can on it. So I won't deny any of what you said. But there's one thing more to be said even so. Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things, trees and grass and sun and moon and stars and Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I can say is that in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. And that's a funny thing when you come to think of it. We're just babies making up a game, if you're right. But 4 babies playing a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live as like a Narnian as I can, even if there isn't any Narnia. So thanking you kindly for our supper, if these 2 gentlemen and the young lady are ready, we're leaving your court at once and setting out in the dark to spend our lives looking for Overland. Not that our lives will be very long, I should think, but that's small loss if the world's as dull a place as you say. Oh, hurrah, good old Puddleglum, cried Scrub and Jill, but the prince shouted suddenly, where? Look to the witch. And then at this point, the witch, we won't go to that, but the witch turns into a giant snake monster thing, which they then fight and kill before then setting out the rest of the story. But I want to focus mainly on that little bit. What did Puddleglum do? So what's the antidote? If we're being put under a dark enchantment all the time from our environment and then the catechism and everything else, how do we resist? Well, we begin with what Lewis calls a touchstone of reality. Okay? Puddleglum puts his foot in the fire, which clears his head, awakens the anger, and gives him, dissolves the magic. Lewis really believed that pain, suffering, and hardship, and in a different mode, pleasure itself, had a vital role in clearing the mind and enabling a person to see what really matters. And so, in this regard, Lewis wrote at one point, we can ignore, he says, the characteristic, this is from Screwtape Letters, the characteristic of pains and pleasures is that they are unmistakably real. And therefore, as far as they go, give the man who feels them a touchstone of reality. So it's easy to kind of get lost in your head until pain or pleasure. Now, he thinks of pleasure in the sense of like it would be the sort of thing in the Screwtape Letters, he's talking about when the patient goes and takes a walk that he likes and reads a book that he likes and just kind of has this like moment of real joy, which basically then when you have a moment like that compared to the worldly trifles that the devils had been trying to suffocate him with, the comparison was like, oh, this is what real air feels like. I've been suffocating. And that kind of wakes him up and leads him to repentance. So pleasure can do that. A little bit tomorrow in the sermon here, I'll probably gesture towards that sort of thing. But Lewis actually thought that he says this: we can ignore even pleasure, but pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So the pain here is not incidental. It's not that Puddleglum could have kept arguing or given this speech. The pain, and it was deliberately chosen pain in this case for the story's sake, but pain has a way of snapping you out of it. All of a sudden, certain things that felt like they might have been a big deal feel less like a big deal when pain breaks through. So how does that connect? Well, significantly, both pain and pleasure are not controllable. They're not controllable. They can be minimized and numbed, but they impress themselves upon us so that we're forced to deal with reality beyond our own ability to manipulate. And so in doing this, I think what Lewis is addressing is the need to what Lewis is doing is saying you need to actually address those environmental factors. You can't try to fight this purely at the sort of rational level. There's an environmental component to the fight of faith. If modern technoculture has gotten so deep into our blood that we experience it as devoid of anything immaterial, spiritual, or supernatural, like if that's what's happened, then we have to develop new habits that reinforce that reality itself actually is beyond human control. Okay, you have to actually do this. Now, how would you even go about it? Well, we can talk more in the Q&A. You can ask more questions about this because I want to at some level, you could touch grass. Okay? You have to touch grass. There's a way in which our modern insulation from all of our basic kind of needs, say agriculturally, actually is catechizing us into thinking that the world is just a world for me and doesn't have agencies that might resist, okay? So to touch grass, to grow things, forces you to develop patience, right? It doesn't matter that you put the seed in the ground. It doesn't matter that you want the fruit now. The ground doesn't care. The ground says it'll come when it comes. And you realize all of a sudden that you can do all the things that you need to do. You put some fertilizer in there, or whatever. You plant the seeds, and at some level, then it's out of your hands. And if it's out of your hands, you have to start to realize whose hands is it in? Right? Whose hand is all of this in? Whose hand am I in? You see how that kind of catechizes you in a different orientation to reality? Just real subtle. It doesn't have to be that everybody has to become a farmer. But it does mean that there's a certain kind of thing that happens when you orient to reality that is outside of your control, that is still subject to your influence and stewardship. This would be the difference between a kind of domination of the modern technoculture versus a dominion, a fruitful dominion that cuts with the grain of God's reality, that says, hey, there's a world and that has agency and purpose and intention, and I have to learn how to navigate that. But I am co-working with things that are beyond me, not simply imposing my will upon them. Does that make sense? It's a hard thing to kind of capture, and it's not maybe not the most important element, but I think it does factor in. The other day, I watched on Canon Plus the new documentary featuring Joel Salatin, if you know who Joel Salatin is. He's the lunatic farmer. If you haven't seen that, go watch it. And it's a really good example of what I'm talking about on this point. Because what Salatin has done is he says modern commercial agriculture is basically a really good example of the kind of break the world in order to build the world mentality of modern technology. It's like we're just get your chemicals, break everything down, wipe out all the things except the thing that you want and hope it all works, right? And what he's discovered in sort of eschewing that vision of agriculture is that, like, no, God made the world in a certain way, and if you cut with the grain of the way he made things, right, if you use the cows and the chickens in concert with one another and take the God made the cows in a certain way, made the chickens a certain way, and they can actually, human ingenuity can say, hey, if we do this next to that, if we have the chickens follow the cows, if we have the cows fertilize rather than getting chemical fertilizers, all of a sudden we actually are more fruitful because we're cutting with the grain of reality. And it's very manifest that ability, like our ingenuity put things next to each other, but we did not make that. Somebody else did. Somehow or other, this other agency is out there making things work. And so it's a different orientation to that, in that case, agriculture. But I would say there's other elements of this, and I would encourage you to think about them. How is it that you can cultivate habits of mind, habits of heart, habits of lived environment, which reinforce to you that there are other agencies in the world with which you must do? That's the idea. Related to this would be developing rhythms of life. Rhythms of life. Of course, we have our basic weekly rhythm of the Lord's Day. But that's actually a really important pushback against modern technoculture, because modern technoculture says, hey, lust for more, if driven by a fear of having less and less, and bring it all under your reach and increase your share in the world, be productive, optimize, get your to-do list done, and Sabbath comes along and says, but you may not. You may not think of yourself in productive terms. So it's a tricky thing. How do you apply it, right? What are things are you allowed to do? All those sort of questions both Old and New Testaments have to kind of deal with. The thing that we talk about in my home when we're trying to apply Sabbath principles, it's like, because my wife will say, when I'm doing her little needlework stuff, she likes to needle stuff. She's like, I want to do that on a Sunday, but is that okay? And I'm like, are you doing it to get ahead? That's my question. Right? It's not do you enjoy it, because I read a book. I like to read. I teach for a living, and I like to read. So can I not read on the Sabbath? Right? It's like, well, there's a difference between me reading a book on the Sabbath because I want to, and doing it because if I don't, I'll be behind for class on Monday. Right? You can see how the orientation, the posture to the activity is different. And so it's like, she's like, it's just relaxing. It's just, I enjoy working with my hands. That's great. Okay? But if you're doing it because I have to and I need to be productive, right? That's the modern technoculture pressuring you to optimize every aspect of your life, right? And the Sabbath is God's divinely institute resistance to that idea. Your life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions. And God said, Sabbath. So this is an orientation difference. And I would say this is true just in general. What difference does it make to you if I said, hey, I don't want you to be productive, I want you to be fruitful? You just feel the force of those words differently. Well, productivity lends itself to a kind of machinist, mechanistic approach, right? To be productive means I want to produce things. I want to have products. Does that make sense? And there's nothing wrong with that in health. But if everything in your life is oriented toward productivity, it's oriented technologically and technique to maximize and optimize potential, as opposed to fruitfulness. Well, fruitfulness, right, takes us into that agricultural metaphor, where it's like, yes, you can sow the seed, and you can do whatever you can, but at some level, the sun has to shine and the water has to fall, or that thing's not growing. There are other agencies that are involved in your fruitfulness. Does that make sense? It's just a different, and there's an imaginative furniture thing that's happening there. The last thing I would say is, so that's develop fruitful rhythms, including Sabbath, but we could extend this to resisting what Lewis calls the lust for encore. The lust for encore. The itch to have things over again. So this is from Paralandra. So when Ransom goes to Paralandra, the planet Venus, he encounters pleasure for the first time. There's these amazing pleasures that he encounters in the food and in the environment. And at one point, he says, I think this is the one where there's a bubble tree, where you walk, this bubble kind of comes, and if you walk through it, it splashes you and awakens all of your senses, it wakes you up big time. In fact, I may have. So actually, I'll quote this part. This is related to that idea of pleasure. So moved by a natural impulse, he put out his hand to touch it. Immediately, his head, face, and shoulders were drenched with what seemed, in that warm world, an ice-cold shower bath, and his nostrils filled with a sharp, shrill, exquisite scent that somehow brought to his mind the verse in Pope, to die of a rose in aromatic pain. Such was the refreshment that he seemed to himself to have been, till now, but half awake. When he opened his eyes, which had closed involuntarily at the shock of moisture, all the colors about him seemed richer, and the dimness of that world seemed clarified. A re-enchantment fell upon him. Now, this is a good re-enchantment, right? A re-enchantment. He had been disenchanted. This thing woke him up, right? Woke him up. Then he thought, wow, that was one little bubble tree, and then he can see a bunch of other bubble trees. So what do you think he thought? What's the next thought you're going to think? If you just you get that amazing experience, and then you see more bubbles right in front of you, okay? And you're 5, right? You're looking at it, and you're like, I wonder what would happen if I ran through all of them, right? What would that be like? But he was restrained by the same sort of feeling which had restrained him overnight from tasting a second gourd. He had had this experience earlier. He had always disliked the people who encored a favorite air in an opera. That just spoils it, had been his comment. But this now appeared to him as a principle of far wider application and deeper moment. This itch to have things over again, that's encore. As if life were a film that could be unrolled twice or even made to work backward. Was it possibly the root of all evil? He says, no, of course, the love of money was called that. But then he thought, but wait a minute. But money itself, perhaps one valued it chiefly as a defense against chance, a security for being able to have things over again, a means of arresting the unrolling of the film. You can hear the desire for control. Right? And so Lewis says, I want to have it now, I want to have it now, I want it now, I want it now. Right? To resist that lust for encore, for him, was a key element of retaining one's humanness. He says, every now and then, this is another instance on Paralandra, every now and then one struck a berry he's eating, which had a bright red center. So he's eating this food, they're really good. And he says, these were savory, so memorable among 1,000 tastes that he would have begun to look for them and feed on them only, but that he was once more bidden by that same inner advisor, which had already spoken to him twice. On earth, thought Ransom, they'd soon discover how to breed these red hearts, and they'd cost a great deal more than the others. Money, in fact, would provide the means of saying encore in a voice that could not be disobeyed. Right? That's what money enables us to do. It allows us to control. It allows us to say encore, encore, encore. And this is a really difficult thing. You know, when he says he always didn't like people who wanted to hear that same section of the opera again. And it's like in an age of Spotify playlists and iTunes and everything where it's just like, play it again. I can just play it again. I can just play it again. This is so foreign to us. The idea that you would listen to a song and say, that was good, I'm not going to listen to it again this week, is just so foreign to anything. We go, do it again, but do it again. And we discover, right, what happens after the 15th time of listening to that song. Sorry, Mom, right? That song, which at first had been so moving, all of a sudden is like, bored, right? Law of diminishing returns. Okay? Is there something in the very nature of how God has made us? This is how Lewis thinks about pleasure, that there's a pleasure of anticipation, there's a pleasure of fulfillment, and then there's a pleasure of memory. And we are wired to want to do the fulfillment one only. Again. And so we don't look back. So practically, what difference would this make? Well, I think that one element of this is the way that we orient to seasons. We don't practice this strictly. But I know I have some friends who've done this, and it's been one of those like, I wonder if we should. We have friends who don't eat produce unless it can be grown in that season. Right? Because in principle, you can have strawberries whenever you want. Okay, but it's like, is there something valuable? Now that would be an extremer version of this, but it's the same sort of reason that my wife tells me that I am not allowed to have pumpkin crunch cake at Easter. She's like, it is pumpkin. We do not have pumpkin at Easter. And I'm like, but we could. I am reliably informed that Safeway does in fact stock pumpkin year-round. So we could do it. We could have a pumpkin crunch cake for Easter. She's like, we will not, though. It is a fall dessert, and you will eat it in the fall. I was like, but it's not the fall now, and I would like it now. That's encore, right? And so having seasonal foods which you only eat at certain times of year, allows for two things. You get the joy of the fulfillment, but you also get a joy of anticipation. You look forward. All of us do this at some level with like Thanksgiving, right? It's very rare that most people have like a big turkey dinner other times of year. Maybe you do it at Christmas too. You might do it at Easter, although usually Easter you do a ham. You know why? Because pork is victory food. Jesus rose from the dead. And so, right? So you should eat the pork on the day that Jesus rose from the dead, because the Jews couldn't do that, but they could eat the turkey. They could say thank you for turkey. So, but we have these different foods. The idea is we have different times of year at which certain foods are prominent, which allows you to look forward to them and then look back in them on memory. And Lewis thought that this idea of rhythms of our pleasures actually was a catechizing thing. So that's number one. Pain and pleasure are touchstones of reality. They force themselves upon us and make us realize that we live in a world that has other agencies. What about then the rest of his speech? Having put his foot in the fire, he then goes on to make this speech. And you notice the repeated words in that speech was the word suppose. Suppose we have only dreamed and made up all those things. Suppose we have. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Okay? What is Puddleglum doing? Well, Puddleglum's argument is a reductio ad absurdum, a reduction to absurdity. It's a particular form of argument in which you grant the premise of your opponent and then seek to show that the consequences of granting that are absurd. You follow the train of their logic down the road to show that doesn't make sense. So what Puddleglum does is he grants the witch's perspective. Suppose you're right. Suppose you're right. And then seeks to highlight something that her view cannot adequately explain. Like if you're right, it's a funny thing. It's a funny thing. It's a funny thing. It's a funny thing. In doing so, Puddleglum is actually showing his commitment to all of reality, not just the witch's real world reality, the material world, this world of mine, which is the only world. Puddleglum's saying, I'm actually committed to the bigger world. So Puddleglum, unlike the witch, is a thoroughgoing realist, not a partial realist like the witch. So what is he doing? What kind of argument is this? Well, at one level, it's the argument from desire. This is one of Lewis's more common arguments for the Christian faith. So when Puddleglum says, suppose we've only dreamed or made up those things, suppose we have, suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world, well, the made-up things seem more important than the real ones, Your kingdom seems like it's pretty terrible, and we're just babies making up a game, but we made up a play world which whips your real world. That's really odd. And we need to explain that. Here's Lewis. The Christian says creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. A baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. There is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Lewis's argument is, hey, we're babies and we want a world with suns and lamps, or suns and lions. We want a world with sky and trees. Like, we have these desires. It's a funny thing that your world has nothing like that. Maybe it means that this isn't all there is. Here it is again. Lewis says, do what they will, then, we remain conscious of a desire which no natural happiness will satisfy. But is there any reason to suppose that reality offers any satisfaction to it? Being hungry doesn't prove that you'll get bread. Right? He's answering an objection. Being hungry doesn't prove that you'll get bread. I think it might be urged that this misses the point. A man's physical hunger does not prove that that man will get any bread. He may die of starvation on a raft in the Atlantic. But surely a man's hunger does prove that he comes of a race which repairs its body by eating and inhabits a world where eatable substances exist. In the same way, though I do not believe, I wish I did, that my desire for paradise proves that I shall enjoy it, I think it a pretty good indication that such a thing exists and that some men will. A man may love a woman and not win her, but it would be very odd if the phenomenon called falling in love occurred in a sexless world. Okay, now you hear the echo? It would be very odd, right? It would be very odd if falling in love exists in a world that had no sex. It's like, that wouldn't fit. It's a funny thing that you have babies making up a game in a world where such games mean nothing. That's a funny thing. That's the argument from desire. This is a species of argument. It's a variation of an argument Lewis makes in other areas. There's an argument from morality. Lewis does a similar thing here. It runs like this. Human beings make moral judgments all the time. Call certain things good, certain things evil, certain things right, certain things wrong. And in doing so, we are appealing to an objective standard of behavior outside of us. And this is true whether we're judging neighbors or Nazis. The very fact of our judgment testifies to our belief in a real objective good that stands over us and to which we ought to conform. There is a real moral law constantly pressing upon us. And Lewis is clear. He's like, that doesn't get you to Christianity. It doesn't get you the whole way. But the existence of that universal law does seem to imply a lawgiver, and thus opens the way for further discussion of what he might be like. Okay? It's an argument from morality. It's a funny thing. It's a funny thing to live if you, in other words, Lewis thought every time you squabble and say that's not fair, right? It would be a funny thing if you keep, like, you squabbling in a world with no universal morals is a funny thing. Why do you keep saying that's not fair when you don't believe that fairness is a universal thing? That's a funny thing. Maybe your squabbling is actually testifying to something more real that the spell that you're under is denying. The most important version of this argument, though, I think for Lewis, was the argument from reason. I actually think that the movement in the story from when Puddleglum says there's the sun, I've seen the sun, there is no sun, it's just a lamp, and then the move from that to Aslan is a move in Lewis's mythology from reason to Christ. Aslan represents Christ, we know that. The sun has often been a metaphor for reason, for enlightenment. So what is the argument here? Here's how it is in Lewis. After studying his environment, man has begun to study himself. Up to that point, he had assumed his own reason, and through it, seen everything else. Now his own reason has become the object. It is as if we took our eyes out to look at them. Thus studied, his own reason appears to him as, listen, the epiphenomenon which accompanies chemical or electrical events in a cortex which is itself the byproduct of a blind evolutionary process. In other words, your thought is just brain secretion. It's your brain burped and you had a thought. You call that thought. His own logic, Lewis says, hitherto the king whom events in all possible worlds must obey becomes merely subjective. There is no reason for supposing that it yields truth. All of a sudden, if you reduce reason to just brain secretion, all of a sudden you have no reason to believe that your brain secretes. You don't have any reason to believe in a brain. Reason has been debunked itself. So this is the argument from reason. Human thought cannot merely be a fact about ourselves, but must be in principle capable of giving us insight into reality. Lewis regularly quoted an unbelieving philosopher named J.D.S. Haldane, and this is the quote: "If my mental processes are determined wholly, completely, by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. And hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be made of atoms." In other words, all knowledge depends on the validity of inference, and therefore inference must in principle be more than a subjective phenomena. It's a real insight into the way that things are. If this is so, human thinking, human logic testifies to the existence of a cosmic or supercosmic reason with a capital R in which the universe is saturated. And again, this argument doesn't get you the whole way to Christianity. It does seem to refute naturalism and materialism. Here's Lewis again. Mechanism, like all materialist systems, breaks down at the problem of knowledge. If thought is the undesigned and irrelevant product of cerebral motions, why should we trust it? He goes on elsewhere. I won't belabor this because he does this a lot. This is one of the most common things. Lewis was regularly going, his refutation of naturalism was always like, all I know is the witch's world can't be the real world. It doesn't tell us what the world really is like. You need more arguments for that. But the main objection in the modern world to Christianity was by naturalism and materialism, atheistic naturalism, materialism, right? And so he says, well, the one thing I know is that one can't be true. Why not? Because it can't explain itself. It can't give an account of itself. He says, reason cuts its own, or naturalism cuts its own throat. How so? Every particular thought is always, by all men, discounted the moment they believe it can be explained without remainder as the result of irrational causes. So if you know that the person who's speaking to you and that what he is saying is completely due to a bit of bone pressing on his brain, or that he has a psychological complex, and you know that the reason he's talking that way is because of the psychological complex or the bone on his brain, you immediately discount what he says. On naturalism's view, that's what all human thought is. It's just matter in motion. It's just brain secretion. It cuts its own throat. So naturalism, he says, goes on claiming territory after territory. First the natural world, the inorganic, then animals, then man's body, then his emotion, and it finally gets up to reason, and it takes this last fatal step, and it invalidates every step that came before it. Because your reason itself is now subject to the same debunking that everything else is. You must give up thinking altogether or begin over again from the ground floor. Whatever else we may claim to believe about the universe, at least we know this. Naturalism is false. The validity of rational thought demonstrate that there must be a transcendental, supernatural reality according to which we think and reason. So, and then there's other quotes I could do here. So the common threads in those three arguments, argument from desire, argument from morality, and argument from reason, is this. The existence of the defect testifies to the existence of the perfection. If you believe people can be wrong, then you must believe that things are true. If you believe that people can be evil, you must believe in the good. If you believe that emptiness is a real thing, hunger is a real thing, you believe satisfaction for that thing exists. And so you could, instead of saying argument from desire, argument from reason, argument from morality, you could speak of the argument from error. The argument from error. The argument from evil, not the problem of evil, it's the argument from evil. Why? Like, this is actually a really, it's a funny thing. People who deny that good and evil are anything are so outraged at all the great evils in the world. The outrage you should think of as God has just planted a flag in that rebel soul. And their sense of outrage, at whatever outrageous they, even if you think that what they're outraged by isn't outrageous, right? The environment or whatever. You could, like, whatever the outrage is that they're outraged by, you may go, I don't agree with that. But the fact of their outrage is a testimony that they believe in something transcendent and supernatural and good. And so, the second thread is that such beliefs, right? Such beliefs, outside of insane asylums, are ineradicable. You cannot get rid of them. Whatever theories people may have, whatever philosophies they may invent, everybody is going to keep on believing, identifying errors, making moral judgment, and pursuing satisfaction somewhere. Like, they're just gonna. It doesn't matter what they say, they're just gonna. And the persistence of those phenomena cries out for an explanation. It's a funny thing. So, this brings us back then. We find ourselves then in an intelligible universe with minds marked by intelligence. We discover and operate as though the world has meaning, which means there must be a meaner. If there's meaning, there must be a meaner, to coin a phrase. It doesn't get you to Christianity, but it does refute naturalism. And so this is how I would summarize this part. We see then in simple everyday phenomena, God is testifying to his existence. Paul says he's actually not far from each one of us. In a sense, you could say this: God is as near to you as your own thinking, your own judging, and your own desiring. That's how close he is. Every time you think, every time you make a moral judgment, every time you desire something, that is God saying, I'm here. There's reason with a capital R. There's the lawgiver. There is the satisfaction of your soul. No matter what we think, we evidence a belief in inference, logic, and error, and therefore in truth, and God is the truth. When we evaluate and judge, when we condemn or approve something, when we accuse or commend it, we believe in morality, we believe in standards, we believe in the good, and therefore he is the good. And when we desire and pursue satisfaction, when we long and ache and hope and feel frustration at our desires being unsatisfied, we evidence our belief in meaning, in purpose, in fullness, and in life, and he is the life. That's the arguments. But Puddleglum doesn't just make a supposal argument, a reductio argument. He also does a couple of other things. Number 3, he says, I'm on Aslan's side, even if there's no Aslan. This is where people kind of go, oh. But again, he's doing the supposal. He's going, let's just hypothetically say you're right. What is going on? This is the virtue of faith. Lewis distinguished faith in 2 senses. Sense number 1, faith A, what he called faith A, is a settled intellectual assent to some truth claim. So that means I believe it to be true. That's faith A. Faith B, he says, that's a trust or a confidence in God. So believing that Jesus rose from the dead and then having a confidence and trust in the God who raised him from the dead. Those are different. Does that make sense? And you could have the first one and not have the second. The demons have the first. They believe that God is one, and they shudder. Does that make sense? 2 different senses of faith. The issue is that in the modern world, under the influence of the dark enchantment, threats to our faith B, our confidence in God, often take the form of a loss of faith A. He's not real. Does that make sense? So, what undermines our confidence in the Lord is he real? That's a faith A kind of question. And so, in other words, and this accounts for the odd doubts that modern Christians have, who are on the one hand clinging to God for dear life while doubting his existence. It's a weird thing, isn't it? And again, this is different than the ancient doubts. When the psalmist doubted, he knew God was there. He just wasn't sure he was good or that he cared. But he knew he was there. We're in the weird position of going like, God, I am clinging to you and I'm begging you and I don't know if you're there. That's a really strange thing. In other words, here's what we do. We say, like Puddleglum, I'm on Aslan's side, even if there is no Aslan. Even if that little doubt in my head is true, I'm with God. I'm with Jesus. All my eggs are in the Jesus basket. That's what I'm doing. How can we explain it? So Lewis goes on to say, in Mere Christianity, about faith versus moods. And so I want to put some of what we're talking about here now in the category of mood. What's a mood? There will come a moment when there is bad news, or a man is in trouble, a Christian, or he's living among a lot of other people who don't believe in Christianity, and all of at once his emotions will rise up and carry out a sort of blitz on his belief. You hang around with a bunch of non-Christians, you get bad news, you're in trouble, and all of a sudden your emotions rise up and attack your faith. Or there will come a moment when he wants a woman, or wants to tell a lie, or feels very pleased with himself, or sees the chance of making a little money in a way that's not perfectly fair. Some moment, in fact, at which it would be very convenient if Christianity were not true. And once again, his wishes and desires will carry out a blitz. And Lewis says, I'm not talking of moments at which any real new reasons against Christianity turn up. Those have to be faced, that's a different matter. I am talking about moments when a mere mood rises up against faith. Okay? That, right, he said, this is something he struggled with in a letter he wrote to a friend. He said, right after his conversion, the trouble with me is a lack of faith. I have no rational ground for going back to the arguments that convince me that God's real. But it's the irrational dead weight of my old skeptical habits. It's the spirit of this age, the cares of the day. They steal away all my lively feeling of the truth. And often when I pray, I wonder if I am not posting letters to a non-existent address. And if you hear in that, he says, it's my old skeptical habits. Remember when in the story, it's not hard to shake off in 30 minutes an enchantment that you've been under for 10 years. Okay? Rillian had a hard time shaking it off. Lewis had a hard time shaking off his skeptical habits. The spirit of the age, that's the incense in the air. He says, mind you, I don't think so. I don't think that I'm posting letters to a non-existence address. My reasonable mind is convinced, but I often feel the other way. Nothing to do, though, but peg away. One falls so often it hardly seems worth picking up oneself and going on through the farce of starting over again. Still, this seeming absurdity is the only sensible thing I do, so I must continue it. And all the time, on the other side, the imaginative side, I get such glimpses and vanishing memories that take my breath away. As if they said, look at what you're losing, as if they were just to deprive one of all excuse. And so all of us, so basically, I feel the pressure of the mood, and I press on anyway. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there's no Aslan. Our faith in Christ, he says, wavers not so much when real arguments come against it, as when it looks improbable, when the whole world takes on that desolate look, which really tells us much more about the state of our passions and our digestion than about reality. When passion takes part in the game, human reason, listen to this, when passion takes part in the game, human reason, unassisted by grace, you don't have grace, has about as much of a chance of retaining its hold on truths already gained as a snowflake has of retaining its consistency in the mouth of a blast furnace. Your reason, if your passions get involved, your reason will get bowled over unless grace assists. In the grip of passions, all sorts of dubious and preposterous arguments seem plausible. Our moods really do affect our faith, and our moods are frequently influenced by our bodies, what we've eaten, how well we've slept, whether you've exercised, as well as by our circumstances or even the weather, right? And so that kind of thing settles over. And so then Lewis says, faith, in the sense in which I am using the word here, faith B, is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing mood. That's what faith is. Holding on to things you know to be true in the face of shifting moods jumping up and down, getting in your face. This requires a deep act of the will. It requires an act of choice and remembrance. So in the story, you remember that the kids they were guided by the signs. Remember the signs, remember the signs. Say them to yourself when you wake in the morning and when you lie down at night. When you wake in the middle of the night, whatever strange things may happen to you, let nothing turn your mind from following the signs. And then listen to this. I give you a warning, Aslan said. Here on the mountain I have spoken to you clearly. I will not do so often down in Narnia. On the mountain the air is clear, your mind is clear. As you drop down into Narnia, the air will thicken. Take care that it does not confuse your mind. And the signs which you have learned here will not look at all as you expect them to look when you meet them there. That's why it's important to know them by heart and pay no attention to appearances, Remember the signs, believe the signs, nothing else matters. Okay? Now, Jill had for a long time practiced the signs. The reason that she's able in that one little moment to say, there's Aslan, is because she had it deep in her bones. Right? She had said the signs enough that they were down there and gave Grace something to work with. So, that's the task for us, right? Bringing before our minds the truths of the gospel, day in, day out, devotionally, reading our scriptures, praying. These sorts of habits are ways that we cling to faith in the midst of our shifting moods. 2 more. Live like a Narnian. The necessity of obedience. Okay? This is important because it's easy in the midst of doubt to use our doubt as an excuse to disobey. Doubt can frequently become an excuse for disobedience. So we say, well, God hasn't shown himself to me. I don't have those lively feelings of devotion that I had at one time in my life. And so because of that, I give myself a pass on, and then you fill in the blank. Right? Could be your anger. I'm frustrated because God won't show up. Now all of a sudden you snap at your spouse. Could be lust. It could be jealousy and envy. It could be all sorts of things where you say, I'm just going to give myself a pass. I'm not going to live like a Narnian. I'm going to live like an Underlander. I'm going to act as though atheism is true because right now it kind of feels like it is and I'm kind of mad. Jesus, though, says that obedience is a precondition to knowing the truth. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God. In other words, if you will to do God's will, Jesus says that you have to do that before you can know whether the teaching's from God. That comes first, not second. Lewis said it this way. This is Screwtape. This is Screwtape, so invert it. You have to think about it. This is the devil talking. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, I quote this passage, I think, more than anything else I quote in Lewis. Our cause is never more in danger than when a human, no longer desiring, but still intending to do the enemy's will, looks round upon a universe from which every trace of him seems to have vanished, asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys. Notice that. Just break it down. Our cause is never, the demonic cause is never more in danger. This is the biggest thing the devils want to avoid, is when a human, no longer desiring but still intending. You can hear there the echoes of the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Not my will, but yours be done. I don't want to, but I will. No longer desiring. This does not look fun. This does not look pleasant. There are no lively feelings assisting it. I don't want to, but I still will. I'm intending to do the enemy's will. Looks around on a universe from which every trace seems to have vanished. Like, where's God? I don't know where he is. He's gone. God, why have you forsaken me? And obeys anyway. At that point, what can the devil do to you? And the answer is nothing. Nothing. That's the demonic strategy when you're in a low point, when the fog has settled in and you're drooping your head. It's to prey upon your experience of divine absence in order to lead you to abandon him altogether. Even more than that, faithful obedience over time and through the valley of shadows is frequently the pathway to renewed experience of God's presence. Okay? George MacDonald, Lewis's hero, said it this way: obedience is the opener of eyes. Obedience is the opener of eyes. So, we trust God in the face of our shifting moods. We obey him even when we don't want to. What else does Puddleglum say? Well, he says we're leaving. We're out of here. And notice that it's a we. It's not I'm leaving. It's we're leaving. There's a journey to be taken together. Lewis, in one of his more apologetic works, The Miracles, has this, it's a long quote, but I want you to think about what he's suggesting about the modern context in which we live. He says, in the conditions produced by a century or so of naturalism, in the conditions produced by naturalism, okay, you're in the witch's lair with the instant strumming, okay? Plain men, normal men, Puddleglums, are being forced to bear burdens which plain men were never expected to bear before. We must get the truth for ourselves or go without it. Okay? In other words, plain men are being asked to bear a burden they didn't have to bear. There may be 2 explanations for this. Why is this the case? It might be that humanity, in rebelling against tradition and authority, has made a huge mistake. A mistake which will not be the less fatal because the corruptions of those in authority rendered it excusable. So on the one hand, it could be we're super disobedient. That's why plain men are having to bear the burden that they shouldn't have had to bear. Normal people. Okay, we're in rebellion. He says, or on the other hand, it might be that the power which rules our species, okay, that God, is at this moment carrying out a daring experiment. Could it be intended that the whole mass of the people should now move forward and occupy for themselves those heights which were once reserved only for the sages? In other words, is God saying, hey, society, humanity, time to level up? Previously, sages had to wrestle with these big questions. Now normal people do. Okay? Why? Because God's after a society of sages. So we're leaving together. This emphasizes the need for community. Puddleglum does not set out on his own, strike out on his own to figure it out. He says, we're leaving, me and the kids and the prince, and we're going to journey together. So, in the face of doubts, what should you do? You should go to church. You should not neglect the meeting of the saints, the assembly of the saints. That's a bad habit, the Bible says. The habit of some that leads them to fall away. That evil, unbelieving heart kind of rises up when you isolate yourself from God's people. So leave together, journey together, walk together. Last thing, and then we'll take some questions. Looking for overland. This is a posture of risk. One of the things to do in the face of the kind of doubts that Lewis is depicting is to actually own the risk. Don't pretend that if you have doubts, don't pretend that they're not real. They are real. They're there. And trying to push them out of your mind by brute force will not work. They will come back with a vengeance. So instead, you should ask yourself this question. Man, it feels risky. I don't know. Is Narnia real? Is Narnia not real? Is God real? Is God not real? I don't know. In the face of that uncertainty, the question you should ask yourself is, given that risk that you could be wrong, one way or the other, what posture should you have? Where should you stand as you try to figure it out? How should you face the risk of being wrong? Should you face it from a position of faith or from unbelief? This really matters. One posture says, I'm going to step outside of faith and into unbelief, and until I know for sure, I'm not stepping back into faith. I'm going to doubt out here and try to get back there. The other says, I'm going to stand in here from faith, and I'm going to ask all of my questions. Honestly, forthrightly, while going to church, doing my devotions, praying, right? Changing my habits, making sure that I've eaten well, making sure that I'm exercising. I'm going to do all of the things, and I'm going to ask my questions from here and see what happens. You own the risk. Lewis, so let me close with this notion of cultivating the desire for our own far-off country. Lewis says, I'm going to get this larger quote. I quoted the first part of it. I'm going to continue to quote the rest of it. These things, the beauty, the memory of our past, all of these things where the glory comes to us, are images of what we really desire, but they're not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we've never yet visited. Do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am. Remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them, and you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. He goes on to say, we do not merely want to see beauty, though God knows even that is bounty enough. We want something else which can hardly be put into words. We want to be united with the beauty that we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, and to become part of it. That's why we have peopled air and earth and water with gods and goddesses and nymphs and elves, that though we cannot, yet these projections can enjoy in themselves that beauty, grace, and power of which nature is the image. This is why the poets tell us such lovely falsehoods. They talk as if the west wind could really sweep into a human soul, but it can't. They tell us that beauty born of murmuring sound will pass into a human face, but it won't. So this is the myth, right? It won't. There's not. They're projections. You hear it? Listen to it. Or not yet. For if we take the imagery of Scripture seriously, if we believe that God will one day give us the morning star, and cause us to put on the splendor of the sun, then we may surmise that the ancient myths and the modern poetry, which are so false as history, may be very near the truth as prophecy. At present, we are on the outside of the world and the wrong side of the door. We discern the freshness and purity of the morning, but they don't make us fresh and pure. We cannot mingle with the splendors that we see. But all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. Someday, God willing, we shall get in. We shall get in. So Lewis is commending, okay, what should you do? You're not in yet. You're on the wrong side of the door. What should you do? Like Puddleglum. We're leaving, and we're going to go spend the rest of our life searching for Overland. And then you get the nice little Puddleglum, like, probably going to die, but like, we're going to look. We're going to keep looking. That's the posture of faith and obedience in the midst of the witch's kingdom.